Our story begins in the summer of 1870 in the frontier town of Helena, Montana Territory. At the time, Helena was a thriving gold mining town with a population of 3,106. It was here that the decision was made that now was the time. The year before, 1869, a small group of prominent figures in the Helena community, including Truman Everts, considered an exploratory trip into the Yellowstone area to see if rumors of volcanic wonders were true. They didn't go, but a small group did. Now it was their time. But the attraction of experiencing volcanic wonders was not the only reason to explore the Yellowstone area. Another was the Northern Pacific Railroad. Chartered in 1864 to connect Duluth, Minnesota to Tacoma, Washington Territory, the railroad was initially financed by Jay Cooke and promoted by a business partner and one of the Helena Group, Nathaniel P. Langford. Departing on August 6, 1870, a group of 9 explorers, with Truman Everts, left Helena for the unknowns of Yellowstone. Henry Dana Washburn was selected to lead the group. He would provide both leadership and skills needed to map the uncharted region. From Helena, the distance to the northern Yellowstone area was a bit over 150 miles of difficult, mountainous terrain. Along the way, the Helena group stopped at Fort Ellis and were assigned a military escort of 7 men, led by the youthful and energetic Lieutenant Donay, to provide protection against potential hostile Indian tribes. For a little over a month, the Helena party explored, mapped, and documented the upper Yellowstone River, including its lake, searching for its source and verifying earlier reports of geothermal wonders. Their experience was documented by Nathaniel Langford and shared nationally in Scribner's Magazine in 1871. Langford. The stories told by trappers and mountaineers of the natural phenomena of that region were so strange and marvelous that as long as 1866 I first contemplated the possibility of organizing an expedition with the express purpose of exploring it. Langford. During the past year, meeting with several gentlemen who expressed like curiosity, we determined to make the journey in the months of August and September. End quote. Note, this is when the Yellowstone River is usually less challenging to cross. Langford. The Yellowstone and Columbia Rivers, the first flowing into the Missouri and the last into the Pacific, divided from each other by the Rocky Mountains, have their source within a few miles of each other. Both rise in the mountains which separate Idaho from the new territory of Wyoming, but the headwaters of the Yellowstone are only accessible from Montana Territory. Langford. The source of the Yellowstone is in a magnificent lake nearly 9,000 feet above the level of the ocean. In its course of 1,300 miles to the Missouri, it falls about 7,200 feet. Its upper waters flow through deep canyons and gorges and are broken by immense cataracts and fearful rapids, presenting at various points some of the grandest scenery of the continent. Langford. This country is entirely volcanic and abounds in boiling springs, mud volcanoes, high mountains of sulfur, and geysers, more extensive and numerous than those of Iceland. Four days after following the Yellowstone River southward on August 30th, the party reached Yellowstone Falls and spent several days exploring it and the canyon. Langford was deeply moved by the experience, writing, "The solemn grandeur of the scene surpasses description. It must be seen to be felt." Langford. The Great Falls are at the head of a remarkable canyon, a gorge through volcanic rocks 50 miles long and varying from 1,000 to nearly 5,000 feet in depth. In its descent through this wonderful chasm, the river falls almost 3,000 feet. On September 3rd, the party left the Great Canyon of the Yellowstone and proceeded up through a beautiful valley to Lake Yellowstone, camping just east of the river's outlet. From the 4th to the 8th of September, the party explored and mapped the eastern and southern side of the lake. Then, on the morning of September 9th, they discovered Truman Everts was missing. Everts was 54 at the time of the expedition, between jobs and living with his daughter Bessie in Helena. Everts was the oldest member of the party. He was a tad adventurous and had some wilderness experience. He was also nearsighted. Everts. In searching for the trail, I became somewhat confused. The falling foliage of the pines had obliterated every trace of travel. I was obliged frequently to dismount, and while surveying the ground, my horse took fright. I turned in time to see him disappearing. That was the last I ever saw of him. Everts. It was yet quite dark. My blankets, gun, pistols, fishing tackle, matches, everything, except the clothing on my person, a couple of knives, and a small opera glass, were attached to the saddle. Everts. At no time during my period of exile did I experience so much mental suffering from the cravings of hunger as when, exhausted with this long day of fruitless search, I resigned myself to a couch of pine foliage in the pitchy darkness of a thicket of small trees. Naturally timid in the night, I fully realized the exposure of my condition. Everts. I peered upward through the darkness, but all was blackness and gloom. The wind sighed mournfully through the pines. The forest seemed alive with the screeching of night birds, the angry barking of coyotes, and the prolonged, dismal howl of the gray wolf. After spending his first restless night sleeping on the ground in Yellowstone, Everts rose early and began walking west. The party had decided earlier that if anyone became lost, they traveled to the southwest part of the lake, where thermal features were visible. This area is today's West Thumb Geyser Basin. At the time, Everts couldn't actually see the lake. All he could see was dense forest. Everts. It was midday when I emerged from the forest into an open space at the foot of the peninsula. A broad lake of beautiful curvature with magnificent surroundings lay before me, glittering in the sunbeams. A wide belt of sand formed the margin, which I was approaching, directly opposite to which towered the loftiest peak of a range of mountains apparently interminable. Everts had stumbled upon Heart Lake, one of the loveliest locations in Yellowstone, surrounded by hot springs and sitting at the base of 10,313-foot Mount Sheridan. It was here, soon finding himself caught in a seasonal snowstorm, Everts found warmth, food, shelter, and discovered fire. Everts, the ascending vapor from innumerable hot springs and the sparkling jet of a single geyser added the feature of novelty to one of the grandest landscapes I ever beheld. Seen under favorable circumstances, this assemblage of grandeur, beauty, and novelty would have been transporting. But, jaded with travel, famished with hunger, and distressed with anxiety, I was in no humor for ecstasy. Everts, I longed for food, friends, and protection. Associated with my thoughts, however, was the wish that some of my friends of peculiar tastes could enjoy this display of secluded magnificence, now, probably, for the first time beheld by mortal eyes. Everts, the transition from joy to grief brought with it a terrible consciousness of the horrors of my condition. But night was fast approaching, and darkness would come with it. While looking for a spot where I might repose in safety, my attention was attracted to a small green plant of so lively a hue as to form a striking contrast with the deep pine foliage. Everts. For closer examination, I pulled it up by the root, which was long and tapering, not unlike a radish. It was a thistle. I tasted it. It was palatable and nutritious. My appetite craved it, and the first meal in 4 days was made on thistle roots. Eureka! I had found food. Everts, overjoyed at this discovery, with hunger allayed, I stretched myself under a tree upon the foliage which had partially filled the space between trunks and fell asleep. How long I slept, I know not, but suddenly I was roused by a loud, shrill scream, like that of a human being in distress. There was no mistaking that fearful voice. It was the screech of a mountain lion, so alarmingly near as to cause every nerve to trill with terror. To yell in return, seize with a convulsive grasp the limbs of the friendly tree, and swing myself into it, was the work of a moment. Scrambling hurriedly from limb to limb, I was soon as near the top as safety would permit. The savage beast was snuffing and growling below, apparently on the very spot I had just abandoned. I answered every growl with a responsive scream. Terrified at the delay and pawing of the beast, I increased my voice to its utmost volume, broke branches from the limbs, and, in the impotency of fright, madly hurled them at the spot whence the continued howlings proceeded. All in vain. The terrible creature pursued his walk around the tree, lashing the ground with his tail and prolonging his howlings almost to a roar. It was too dark to see, but the movements of the lion kept me appraised of its position. Whenever I heard it on one side of the tree, I speedily changed to the opposite, an exercise which, in my weakened state, I could only have performed under the impulse of terror. Just at this moment, it occurred to me that I would try silence. Clasping the trunk of the tree with both arms, I sat perfectly still. Moments passed with me like hours. After a lapse of time which I cannot estimate, the beast gave a spring into the thicket and ran screaming into the forest. My deliverance was effected. Everts, I wondered what fate was in reserve for me, whether I would ultimately sink from exhaustion and perish of starvation, or become the prey of some of the ferocious animals that roam these vast fastnesses. I was roused from this train of reflection by a marked change in the atmosphere. One of those dreary storms of mingled snow and rain common to these high latitudes set in. My clothing, which had been much torn, exposed my person to its pitiless pelting. An easterly wind, rising to a gale, admonished me that it would be furious and of long duration. None of the discouragements I had already met dissipated the hope of rejoining my friends, but, foreseeing that delay, now unavoidable, I knew that my escape from the wilderness must be accomplished, if at all, by my own unaided exertions. Everts, taking advantage of a lull in the elements on the morning of the third day, I rose early and started in the direction of a large group of hot springs. Chilled through, with my clothing thoroughly saturated, I lay down under a tree upon the heated incrustation until completely warmed. My heels and the sides of my feet were frozen. Everts, as soon as the warmth had permeated my system and I had quieted my appetite with a few thistles, I took a survey of my surroundings and selected a spot between two springs sufficient to afford heat at my head and feet. I built a shelter of pine branches and stowed myself away to await the close of the storm. Thistles were abundant, and I had fed upon them long enough to realize that they would, for a while at least, sustain life. In convenient proximity to my abode was a small, round, boiling spring, which I called my dinner pot, in which, from time to time, I cooked my roots. Everts. This establishment, the best I could improvise with the means at hand, I occupied 7 days. The vapor which supplied me with warmth saturated my clothing with its condensations. I was enveloped in a perpetual steam bath. At first this was barely preferable to the storm, but I soon became accustomed to it, and before I left, though thoroughly parboiled, actually enjoyed it. Everts. I had little else to do during my imprisonment but cook, think, and sleep. Of the variety and strangeness of my reflections it is impossible to give the faintest conception. Much of the time was given to devising means for escape. Selfish as the thought may seem, there was nothing I so much desired as a companion in misfortune. Everts. Nothing gave me more concern than the want of fire. I recalled everything I had ever read or heard of the means by which fire could be produced, but none of them were within my reach. An escape without it was simply impossible. But then a gleam of sunshine lit upon the bosom of the lake, and with it the thought flashed upon my mind that I could, with a lens from my opera glasses, get fire from heaven. Oh, happy life-renewing thought! I was now the happy possessor of food and fire. These would carry me through. Everts. My stay at the springs was prolonged several days by an accident that befell me on the third night after my arrival. An unlucky movement while asleep broke the crust on which I was reposed, and the hot steam, pouring upon my hip, scalded it severely. Added to my frostbitten feet already festering, this was the cause of frequent delay and unceasing pain through all my wanderings. Now, with renewed hope, having both fire and food, Everts prepared to leave Bessie Lake, who he named after his daughter, but today's Heart Lake. Everts mended his clothing with the unravelings of a linen handkerchief and a needle knife made from the tongue of a buckle, which he cut from his vest. With these tools, Everts also cut the legs and counters from his boots to make a pair of slippers that he fastened to his feet with strips of bark and pouches for carrying food. Roughly 10 days had passed since Everts was separated from his party, but now he was finally ready to leave the warmth, comfort, and shelter of the hot springs and make his escape. His companions had searched and waited for Everts at the rendezvous site, but finally concluded he was not joining them and may be dead. Everts, as I wandered musingly along, the consciousness of being alone and of having surrendered all hope of finding my friends returned upon me with crushing power. Weakened by a long fast, from this time onward to the day of my rescue, my mind was in a condition to receive impressions akin to insanity. I was constantly traveling in dreamland and indulging in strange reveries such as I had never known before. I seemed to possess a sort of duality of being, which, while constantly reminding me of the necessities of my condition, fed my imagination with vagaries of the most extravagant character. Hours passed, and the weather changed again, becoming bitterly cold. So Everts, struggling, found a place to pass the night. Everts, a bleak hillside sparsely covered with pine, afforded poor accommodations for a half-clad, famishing man. I could only keep from freezing by the most active exertion, and walking, rubbing, and striking my numb feet and hands against the logs. It seemed the longest, most terrible night of my life. The burn on my hip was so inflamed that I could only sleep in a sitting posture. Seated with my back against a tree, the smoke from the fire almost enveloping me in its suffocating folds, I vainly tried, amid the din and uproar of this horrible serenade, to woo the drowsy god. My imagination was instinct with terror. At one moment, it seemed as if in the density of a thicket I could see the blazing eyes of a formidable forest monster fixed upon me, preparatory to a deadly leap. At another, I fancied that I heard the swift approach of a pack of yelping wolves through the distant brushwood, which in a few moments would tear me limb from limb. Whenever, by fatigue and weakness, my terrors yielded to drowsiness, the least noise roused me to a sense of the hideousness of my condition. Once in a fitful slumber, I fell forward into the fire and inflicted a wretched burn on my hand. Oh, with what agony I longed for the day. Everts was now walking towards the rendezvous site at present-day West Thumb Geyser Basin. He crossed several outlooks of the lake and marveled at the landscape before him. Everts, I doubt if distress and suffering can ever entirely obliterate all sense of natural grandeur and magnificence. After visiting the rendezvous site and not finding any note or cash from his friends, Everts decided to travel north. around Yellowstone Lake, and then northeast to rejoin the Yellowstone River and follow it north to safety. Eventually, 23 days later, he was rescued, but not before starting a large forest fire and being visited by strange guests. Before Everts departed the lake, an incident occurred that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Everts, an hour of sunshine in the afternoon enabled me to procure fire, which I carried to my camping place. There I built a fire, and to protect myself from the wind, which was blowing violently, lashing the lake into foam, I made a bower of pine boughs, crept under it, and very soon fell asleep. How long I slept, I know not, but I was aroused by the snapping and cracking of the burning foliage, to find my shelter and the adjacent forest in a broad sheet of flame. My left hand was badly burned, and my hair singed closer than a barber would have trimmed it, while making my escape from the semicircle of burning trees. The grandeur of the burning forest surpasses description. An immense sheet of flame, following to their tops the lofty trees of an almost impenetrable pine forest, leaping madly from top to top and sending thousands of forked tongues 100 feet or more into the midnight darkness. I never before saw anything so terribly beautiful. During the fire, Everts lost his buckle-tongue knife, but he also found a new resolve to continue his escape. Slowly he traveled north and then east, back to the familiar Yellowstone River. And then, once again, he was at the canyon of the Yellowstone. Everts. It was a cold, gloomy day when I arrived in the vicinity of the falls. The sky was overcast. I had no heart to gaze upon a scene which a few weeks before had inspired me with rapture and awe. Everts continued on, each day growing weaker, his mind wandering, but he was not alone. Everts, by some process which I was too weak to solve, my arms, legs, and stomach were transformed into so many traveling companions. Often for hours I would plod along, conversing with these imaginary friends. Each had his peculiar wants, which he expected me to supply. The stomach was importunate in his demand for a change of diet, complained incessantly of the roots I fed him, their present effect, and more remote consequences. I would try to silence him with promises, beg him to wait a few days, and when this failed of the quiet I desired, I would seek to intimidate him by declaring, as a sure result of negligence, our inability to reach home alive. The legs implored me for rest, and the arms complained that I gave them too much to do. Troublesome as they were, it was a pleasure to realize their presence. I worked for them, too, with right good will, doing many things for their seeming comfort, which, had I felt myself alone, would have remained undone. Then he was found. Everts, groping along the side of a hill, I became suddenly sensible of a sharp reflection, as of burnished steel. Looking up, through half-closed eyes, two rough but kindly faces met my gaze. "Are you Mr. Everts?" they asked. "Yes, all that is left of him. We have come for you." "Everts, who sent you?" "Rescuers, Judge Lawrence, and some other friends." "Everts, God bless him, and them, and you. I am saved." And with these words, powerless of further effort, I fell into the arms of my preservers, in a state of unconsciousness. I was saved. Jack Baronet and George Pritchard, my two preservers, restored me to consciousness, made a camp upon the spot, and while one went to Fort Alice to return with an ambulance to convey me to the post, the other sat by my side and, with care, sympathy, and solicitude, ministered to my frequent necessities. Everts. In 2 days I was sufficiently recovered in strength to be moved 20 miles down the trail to the cabin of some miners. From these men I received every possible attention which their humane and generous natures could devise. A good bed was provided, game was killed to make broth, and the best stores of their larder placed at my command. For 4 days, at a time when every day's labor was invaluable in their pursuit, they abandoned their work to aid in my restoration. Owing to the protracted inaction of my system and the long period which must transpire before Pritchard's return with remedies, my friends had serious doubts of my recovery. The night after my arrival at the cabin, while suffering the most excruciating agony, and thinking that I had only been saved to die among friends, a loud knock was heard at the cabin door. An old man in mountain costume entered. He listened to the story of my sufferings, and tears rapidly coursed down his rough, weather-beaten face. Everts. But when he was told of my present necessity, brightening in a moment, he exclaimed, "Why, Lord bless you! If that is all, I have the very remedy you need. In 2 hours' time all shall be well with you." Everts. He left the cabin, returning in a moment with a sack filled with the fat of a bear which he had killed the few hours before. From this he rendered out a pint measure of oil. I drank the whole of it. It proved to be the needed remedy, and the next day, freed from pain, with appetite and digestion reestablished, I felt that good food and plenty of it were only necessary for an early recovery. Everts. In a day or two, I took leave of my kind friends, with a feeling of regret at parting and of gratitude for their kindness as enduring as life. Meeting the carriage on my way, I proceeded to Bozeman, where I remained among old friends, who gave me every attention until my health was sufficiently restored to allow me to return to my home at Helena. Everts. My narrative is finished. In the course of events, the time is not far distant when the wonders of the Yellowstone will be made accessible to all lovers of sublimity, grandeur, and novelty in natural scenery, and its majestic waters become the abode of civilization and refinement. I hope, in happier mood and under more auspicious circumstances, to revisit scenes fraught for me with such thrilling interest, to ramble along the glowing beach of Bessie Lake, to sit down amid the hot springs under the shadow of Mount Everts, to thread unscared the mazy forest, retrace the dreary journey to the Madison Range. One day, with enraptured fancy, I hope to again gaze upon the mingled glories and terrors of the great falls and marvelous canyon, and to enjoy, in happy contrast with the trials they recall, their power to delight, elevate, and overwhelm the mind with wondrous and majestic beauty. Truman Everts. Truman Everts was rescued by Baronet and Pritchard. He was described as a walking skeleton, likely weighing only 50 to 60 pounds, and having lost over 100 pounds during his 37-day ordeal. He was also suffering from severe frostbite, burns, especially to his hip from rolling into the hot spring at Hot Lake, and starvation. But he made it, living until the age of 85. He married his second wife in 1891. She was only 24 years old, and they had at least one son. Everts was offered the first superintendency of the newly created Yellowstone National Park, which he turned down because it didn't include a salary. Today, Everts is remembered throughout Yellowstone, having a mountain named after him, and for his ability to survive 37 days lost in the park.